Even a simple janitor can hide amazing knowledge that he hasn't been able to use throughout his life, but at one point this knowledge can turn his life upside down. That's why you shouldn't judge a person by their appearance, because very often they hide something much more, just like in our story today. The air in the packed Atlanta courtroom buzzed with anticipation, an almost tangible mixture of tension and disdain. The polished wooden benches gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, their scent mingling with the faint aroma of paper and ink from the stacks of legal files scattered around. Reporters whispered furiously in the back row, their pens poised to capture every detail of what promised to be an open and shut case. At the center of it all stood Avery Thompson, a quiet man in a neatly pressed, modest uniform, a janitor, accused of stealing a $50,000 gold statuette from the mansion of the wealthy Kingston family, where he had worked for nearly 5 years. Avery's demeanor was unassuming. His posture remained calm, almost too calm for a man facing serious charges. Yet the quiet intensity in his eyes betrayed an inner strength that had yet to be noticed by those who had already dismissed him as guilty. Judge Mary Ellis, known for her stern disposition and legendary impatience for what she called petty criminals, sat at the bench, her gavel resting ominously within reach. Beside her, Prosecutor Nathan Green leaned back in his chair, radiating self-assurance as he shot a smirk toward the defendant. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the audience as Judge Ellis adjusted her glasses and addressed the courtroom. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her tone as cold as the polished marble flooring, "I see you've chosen to represent yourself in this matter. Are we to understand that you believe you are capable of defending yourself against these charges without legal counsel?" Avery nodded once, his voice quiet but steady. "Yes, Your Honor. I intend to prove my innocence." The room erupted into muted laughter, and even Green couldn't suppress a derisive chuckle. "A janitor defending himself in a felony trial," he said loudly enough for the audience to hear. "This will be entertaining, if nothing else." Ellis's lips curled into a thin smile as she rapped her gavel once. "Order in the court," she said, though her tone lacked any real conviction to quell the mockery. Turning back to Avery, she added, "Mr. Thompson, let me remind you that the law is no playground. You are facing a charge of grand larceny, and the evidence against you is substantial. Do you truly believe you can outwit trained legal professionals in this setting?" Avery met her gaze without flinching. "I believe the truth is my best defense, Your Honor. With all due respect, I am prepared to demonstrate that I am innocent of this crime." Nathan Green leaned forward, his smirk broadening. "Well then, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "by all means, let's hear your truth. I'm curious to see how you'll explain away the overwhelming evidence against you." In the front row, the Kingston family sat with an air of smug confidence. The patriarch, Robert Kingston, crossed his legs and exchanged a knowing glance with his wife, whose pearl necklace glinted under the courtroom lights. Their son, Lawrence, sat beside them, his arms folded and an amused expression on his face. Ellis sighed audibly. "Very well, Mr. Thompson. Proceed with your opening statement. And I suggest you make it brief. I have little patience for theatrics." Avery stepped forward, his quiet voice cutting through the whispers and suppressed laughter like a knife. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his hands resting lightly on the defendant's table. "I stand before you today not as a thief, but as a man falsely accused. I intend to prove that I did not steal the statuette and that the evidence presented against me has been carefully manipulated." The room fell into a strained silence. Avery's quiet confidence seemed to momentarily unsettle even the most skeptical observers. Judge Ellis raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. Nathan Green, however, leaned back in his chair, his smirk undeterred. Avery continued, his voice steady and clear. "I will show you that the night in question reveals inconsistencies in the prosecution's story. I will provide evidence, photographic, testimonial, and circumstantial, that points to another suspect. And I will ask that you listen not just to the words spoken in this courtroom, but to the silence of the facts that the prosecution has chosen to ignore." His words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of revelation. The reporters exchanged furtive glances, sensing that this case might not be as straightforward as they had initially assumed. Even the jurors, who had entered the courtroom with varying degrees of skepticism, now leaned forward slightly in their seats. Judge Ellis tapped her pen against her desk, her expression unreadable. "Proceed, Mr. Thompson," she said curtly. "The floor is yours." Avery nodded, his gaze steady as he turned to face the courtroom. The faint sound of a chair creaking somewhere in the gallery broke the silence, but Avery paid it no mind. He was focused, resolute, and ready to dismantle the case piece by piece. The courtroom remained tense, charged with the raw energy of Avery Thompson's opening statement. After a moment of heavy silence, Avery carefully reached into his folder and withdrew a stack of high-resolution photographs. The images, which he introduced as surveillance footage from the night of the alleged theft, were printed on crisp paper and clearly marked with timestamps. He held them up for the court to see. "Your Honor, I present Exhibit A," Avery said, his voice steady despite the undercurrent of cynicism from the prosecution. These photos were obtained through a formal request for surveillance data at the mansion on the night in question. Observe closely. The images show another individual present on the premises, clearly not me, at a time when I was elsewhere. A murmur ran through the courtroom as Judge Mary Ellis scrutinized the photographs. The images depicted a figure, blurred yet distinct enough to raise suspicion, standing near a side entrance of the mansion. The timestamps on the photos indicated that this person was present during the window of time when the theft was said to have occurred. Avery's evidence suggested that the real culprit might be someone else entirely, a fact that, if proven, could exonerate him of all charges. Nathan Green, the prosecuting attorney, scoffed and leaned forward. "These photos look questionable, Mr. Thompson," he interjected. "How can we be certain that these images haven't been tampered with or misinterpreted? You expect this court to believe that a janitor could orchestrate such a defense based solely on pictures?" Avery met Green's challenge calmly. "I understand your skepticism, Mr. Green. That is why I took every precaution to obtain these records through proper channels. The files are accompanied by a certified statement from the facility's security manager, verifying their authenticity." He slid the accompanying documentation across to the clerk for Judge Ellis's review. Judge Ellis picked up the documents and examined them carefully, her eyes narrowing as she traced the details printed on the security report. The sound of shuffling paper and subdued whispers filled the room. "These appear to be in order," she said slowly, her tone measured yet devoid of warmth. "Mr. Thompson, while the evidence is intriguing, photographs alone do not confirm your innocence. They merely raise further questions about the identity of the intruder." Avery nodded, accepting the judge's caution with quiet dignity. "I agree, Your Honor, and that is why I call next Exhibit B, a testimony from a reliable source." He paused for a brief moment, glancing at the audience where a few sympathetic faces turned their attention towards him, and then continued, "I would like to call Ms. Angela Carter, a co-worker at the mansion, who was present that night and heard a conversation that suggests premeditation among the complainants." Without waiting for objections, Avery stepped back and motioned toward the door at the side of the courtroom. A few seconds later, a composed woman in her late 20s entered. Angela Carter's attire and demeanor were unassuming. She looked every bit like one of the regular employees at the mansion, yet her eyes held a spark of determination. "Please state your full name and your connection to the case for the record," Judge Ellis instructed sharply. Angela cleared her throat and replied, "My name is Angela Carter, and I am a longtime employee at the Kingston Mansion. On the night of the incident, I was working in the background. I overheard discussions among members of the Kingston family about positioning Mr. Thompson as the scapegoat for the missing statuette." Her voice, though soft, carried with it undeniable conviction. The room fell silent as Angela's testimony added a new layer of intrigue. Her statement suggested that the complainants themselves had devised a plan to pin the crime on Avery, a plan that had nothing to do with his actions but with their desire to cover up internal misdeeds. Judge Ellis's eyes narrowed as she took in every word. "Thank you, Miss Carter. No further questions," said Judge Ellis curtly. The sound of Angela's measured exit from the stand punctuated the heavy silence. The photographs, the certified security report, and Angela Carter's testimony together cast a long shadow over the prosecution's narrative. The seeds of doubt had been sown. As jurors exchanged thoughtful glances and reporters scribbled notes furiously, it was clear that Avery Thompson's case was beginning to take an unexpected and dramatic turn. Drawing a steady breath, Avery rose again from his seat, his quiet determination filling the room like a silent drumbeat. The courtroom's ambient murmurs quieted as he prepared to deliver his next critical argument. The judge's penetrating eyes and the skeptical glare from prosecutor Nathan Green set the stage for what Avery knew was his moment to challenge the prosecution's narrative head-on. "Your Honor," Avery began in a measured voice, "I wish to invoke the principle established in Brady v. Maryland." His words cut through the charged atmosphere like a clarion call to justice. In that precedent-setting case, it was ruled that the prosecution must disclose any evidence favorable to a defendant that is material to guilt or punishment. I contend that the evidence in this case, namely the surveillance photographs and witness testimonies, should have been shared with the defense before these baseless allegations were levied against me. A murmur stirred among the jurors and the audience as Avery's reference resonated throughout the room. Judge Ellis's gaze momentarily shifted towards the legal texts on the bench, as if weighing the significance of this foundational case law. Nathan Green's confident smirk wavered. "Your Honor," Green interjected sharply, "my learned colleague's reference to Brady v. Maryland is out of context. The evidence presented is not exculpatory in any relevant way, and Mr. Thompson's attempt to cast doubt on our case is, frankly, a distraction." "Distraction, Mr. Green?" Avery's voice remained calm despite the mounting pressure. "I refer to Brady precisely because every piece of evidence that might prove my innocence was intentionally withheld from the defense. In fact, I have reason to believe, based on the records and the formal inquiries I've made, that the prosecution's presentation of this case might be compromised by selective disclosure." The courtroom held its breath as Avery's words sank in. Judge Ellis leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as she considered the implications. The atmosphere grew heavier. The creak of the wooden benches and the faint, rhythmic tapping of pens in the gallery punctuated the palpable tension. Avery continued, "I respectfully submit that the evidence indicates a different scenario than what has been alleged. If you recall, the surveillance photographs, which I introduced earlier, clearly show another individual at the mansion on the night in question. Yet, the prosecution conveniently omits any discussion of these images in their arguments. This suppression of potentially exculpatory evidence is a clear violation of the principles enshrined in Brady v. Maryland and, more broadly, of our duty to uphold justice." At this point, Green shifted uneasily in his seat. His earlier bravado began to crumble as Avery's calm, factual assertions challenged the very core of his prosecutorial narrative. "Mr. Thompson," Green said in a slightly strained tone, "it appears you are trying to turn this courtroom into a forum for your personal grievances rather than addressing the concrete facts of the case." Avery held Green's gaze steadily. "Not personal grievances, Mr. Green," he replied. "I am here to insist on fairness and transparency. I have diligently requested that all evidence, especially that which might exonerate me, be made available. Instead, I have encountered obfuscation and selective disclosure. I stand by my right, as affirmed by the Brady decision, that a defendant must have access to all evidence favorable to their case." Judge Ellis tapped her gavel softly, silencing the brief exchange. "Mr. Thompson, while your invocation of Brady v. Maryland is noted, I must remind you that it is ultimately the court's duty to ensure that all evidence is considered fairly. However, I will allow you to elaborate further on this point." Taking a measured pause, Avery reached into his folder and pulled out a carefully prepared notepad. "I have compiled a list of all discrepancies between the surveillance evidence and the prosecution's timeline, as well as documented communications that suggest certain records were deliberately withheld from my review," he continued, his voice steady and composed. "These irregularities, when viewed in light of the legal requirement for full disclosure, prove that I was set up as a scapegoat." A hushed silence fell over the courtroom as reporters scribbled down every word and jurors exchanged glances laden with a mixture of empathy and curiosity. Some even nodded slowly, recognizing the stark contrast between the calm assertion of truth and Green's faltering counterarguments. Nathan Green's eyes darted nervously between Avery and the judge. "Your Honor," he protested, "I must insist that these issues are peripheral to the case at hand." "Peripherality is a matter for the discretion of the court," Judge Ellis interjected sharply. "Mr. Thompson, since you have made these facts a central part of your defense strategy, the court will take them into consideration." The tension in the room had reached a critical juncture. Avery's unwavering voice and logical appeal to precedent had visibly unsettled the prosecution's stance. As he looked out at the sea of eyes fixated on him, some brimming with hope, others with skepticism, Avery knew that he had laid the groundwork for a turning point in his case. His challenge was not merely to refute the charges against him, but to expose a deeper injustice, the deliberate manipulation of evidence aimed at convicting an innocent man. Before moving to his next piece of evidence, the presentation of a key receipt that further undermined the prosecution's story, Avery took one final, steadying breath. The room seemed to hold its collective breath in anticipation of what was to come. Avery's voice softened as he reached into the folder he had so painstakingly prepared. "Your Honor," he said, his tone resonating with both quiet determination and personal conviction, "I present Exhibit C, a receipt documenting the sale of the statuette on the black market." He slowly slid a crisp, printed receipt across the courtroom desk. The document was stamped with unmistakable details, a signature by a known member of the Kingston family, clearly identifying the transaction as illicit. Judge Ellis leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she examined the receipt. The hushed courtroom held its collective breath. Avery continued, "This receipt, Your Honor, shows that the statuette was sold by the son of the Kingston family, not taken by me. It is accompanied by a statement from the family's official broker, confirming that the transaction was conducted without my involvement." His calm voice filled the room with evidence that sharply contradicted the prosecution's claims. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the audience as Avery took a measured pause. He then shifted slightly, and his tone grew more reflective, almost personal. "I did not come here today solely as a defendant against false charges. I stand before you with a story that is deeply personal." His eyes swept over the courtroom, meeting those of the jurors and even the smirking prosecuting team with a newfound resolve. "Many of you may not know that I have spent countless nights in the public library, poring over legal texts and dusty court rulings. I did this for one very important reason: to protect my daughter from the shadows of injustice that once nearly ruined my life." A brief, heavy silence ensued as Avery's heartfelt words struck a chord. "Years ago," he continued, his voice trembling slightly with emotion yet resolute, "I witnessed a miscarriage of justice that almost led to my daughter's wrongful conviction. I vowed then that no matter how small or insignificant my role might appear, I would fight for the truth. That fight is what compelled me to learn the law on my own." Judge Ellis's previously guarded expression began to soften, a spark of genuine interest flickering in her eyes. Even Prosecutor Green, who had earlier leaned on arrogance, shifted in his seat as if jolted by Avery's unexpected revelation. "I have no formal legal education," Avery admitted quietly, "but I am a self-made scholar. I spent every spare moment studying court cases and statutes, from Brady versus Maryland to every precedent that could guide me. My determination to learn the truth, despite my modest background, has brought me here today to expose a conspiracy against me." Avery's words painted a picture of a man who, despite a lifetime of underestimation, had taken it upon himself to become an expert in the law, a man who was not content to remain silent in the face of injustice. His voice, rich with sincerity and lined with years of quiet struggle, resonated through the courtroom. The gallery, once filled with derisive laughter and dismissive glances, now listened with rapt attention. Judge Ellis looked up from the receipt and the notepad filled with Avery's handwritten notes, her features reflecting surprise and a dawning admiration. "Mr. Thompson," she said slowly, "your presentation of evidence, coupled with your personal commitment to justice, is both compelling and, I must say, rather inspiring. For a long moment, silence reigned as her words began to sink in. Then, soft murmurs of approval started to echo throughout the room. Avery's heart pounded with a mix of relief and cautious optimism. He had finally put forth evidence that not only dismantled the prosecution's narrative but also told a story of deep personal resilience. Before the room could fully react, Judge Ellis cleared her throat. We shall now take a brief recess to review this new evidence in detail. The gavel sound faded into mild clamor as the judges, jurors, and press began whispering about Avery's remarkable turn of events, while the prosecuting team struggled to collect their thoughts. After a lengthy recess during which whispers and hushed debates filled the corridors of the courthouse, Judge Mary Ellis returned to the bench with a somber, reflective expression. The courtroom, already charged by Avery Thompson's impassioned defense, fell instantly silent as she tapped her gavel to call the session back to order. All eyes were fixed on her as she meticulously reviewed the evidence laid out before her. The certified photographs from the mansion's security system, the corroborating statement from the facility's security manager, the sworn testimony of Angela Carter, and the compelling legal arguments Avery had presented, including his invocation of Brady versus Maryland. Judge Ellis cleared her throat and began, after careful consideration of the evidence presented today, it is apparent that the prosecution's case against Mr. Thompson is built on selective disclosure and misinterpretation of facts. The photographs and attendant documentation do not support the allegation that Mr. Thompson was involved in the theft of the statuette. In fact, they raise significant questions regarding the involvement of another party on the night in question. A murmur ran through the courtroom as the Kingston family and their legal team exchanged uneasy glances. Avery sat rigidly at his table, his formal attire and the calm set of his face belying the weight of the moment. Meanwhile, Prosecutor Nathan Green's confident facade began to crumble visibly. His earlier smirk was replaced with a look of increasing dismay. Judge Ellis continued, her tone even but insistent. It is further evident, she declared, from the testimonial evidence provided by Ms. Carter, that there exists credible information suggesting that the complainants themselves, members of the Kingston family, may have orchestrated this scandal to deflect from their internal mismanagement. Such a tactic is an abuse of the judicial process and an affront to the rights of the accused. Green attempted to interject, but Judge Ellis held up her hand firmly. Mr. Green, based on the evidence, I find no basis for the charges against Mr. Thompson. I hereby drop the indictment in its entirety. Moreover, I will be referring this matter to the appropriate internal review committee to investigate potential prosecutorial misconduct. A stunned silence reigned before the murmur of approval began to swell into booming applause. The audience, comprising jurors, reporters, and onlookers, reacted with a mixture of relief and triumph. Even members of the Kingston family, who had once sat with smug expressions in the front row, now wore faces of disbelief. Nathan Green's face burned with humiliation, his earlier haughtiness replaced by dejected resignation. Mr. Thompson, Judge Ellis said finally, her voice softer yet resolute, your evidence and testimony have not only exonerated you of these charges, but have also set an example of vigilance and perseverance in the face of injustice. Let this case be a reminder that the truth, when meticulously pursued and spoken clearly, cannot be suppressed by prejudice or power. At these words, a wave of applause erupted again in the courtroom. Avery allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction, nodding respectfully toward Judge Ellis. His calm, self-taught legal acumen had turned the tide of the entire trial. As the session drew to a close, the sound of relentless clapping, punctuated by whispered congratulations, filled the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, realizing that what they'd witnessed was nothing short of a dramatic reversal. A quiet janitor with unmatched determination had shattered the prejudice stacked against him. The judge's gavel finally fell, and as the session adjourned, the atmosphere transformed from one of tension and derision to one of hope and renewal. The courtroom had not only become the stage for a legal triumph, but had also ignited a spark that promised change beyond these walls. In the days that followed the dramatic courtroom victory, Avery Thompson's name became a symbol of hope and resilience in Atlanta. The story of the quiet janitor who stood up against a biased system spread quickly, not only among the local community but also across regional news outlets and social media platforms. Headlines hailed his unyielding determination, and his testimony was replayed in countless interviews and news segments, inspiring those who had long felt voiceless. At Midtown Middle School, where Avery had once toiled unnoticed, whispers of his triumph reverberated through every hallway. Teachers and students alike spoke of his remarkable performance in hushed, admiring tones. The Kingston family's once smug expressions transformed into shocked disbelief, and even the prosecuting team's reputation was tarnished by the exposure of their selective evidence and hidden agenda. Nathan Green's name was mentioned with scorn by legal circles that watched the case unfold. For Avery, the victory was deeply personal. In the quiet of his modest apartment, where a worn-out copy of a legal textbook sat on the table and a family photo of him with his daughter hung on the wall, he took the time to reflect on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He remembered the countless nights he had spent in the library, poring over case law and studying the principles that he now invoked with such calm authority in court. Every page had been fueled by a desire to shield his daughter from the injustice that had once threatened their lives, a fire that had transformed him from a humble janitor into a self-taught legal warrior. Sitting on the front steps of the courthouse, Avery let the autumn chill of Atlanta wash over him as he slipped his worn cap on a little further and gazed at the towering building that had borne witness to his triumph. "Knowledge is power," he murmured to himself. "In a system that seeks to silence and demean, even the quietest voice can rise to challenge injustice." His mind replayed Judge Ellis's words, "Let this case be a reminder that the truth, when meticulously pursued and spoken clearly, cannot be suppressed by prejudice or power." In those words, Avery found not only vindication but also a call to action. Soon, community leaders and local advocates reached out to Avery, inviting him to speak at schools and civic centers, urging others to learn, to question, and to never allow their voices to be stifled by those in power. His story became a powerful example of self-empowerment, a reminder that anyone, regardless of their background or occupation, could stand up against corruption and injustice if they were willing to learn and persist. In a heartfelt press conference in downtown Atlanta, Avery looked directly into the cameras and said, "I stand here not as a flawless man, but as someone who has learned that even in the darkest moments, the light of truth and education can illuminate the path to justice. I encourage every individual who feels marginalized to educate themselves, to question the narratives imposed upon them, and to always fight for what is right." His message resonated widely, with many echoing his sentiment and demanding greater transparency and fairness in the judicial and corporate systems. As Avery prepared for the next chapter of his life, one that promised to involve mentoring others who faced injustice, he took a final reflective moment. He thought of the struggles he had endured, of the prejudice he had overcome, and of the quiet library nights that had turned him into the defender he had become. "If my story teaches us anything," he thought, "it is that none of us should ever give up on ourselves, even when the odds are overwhelmingly stacked against us." In that moment, Avery Thompson became more than just a name in the court records. He became a local legend, a beacon of hope for those who believed that determination and self-education could break the chains of oppression. What do you think is the most powerful lesson from Avery's journey from an overlooked janitor to a self-taught legal warrior? Have you ever found strength in unexpected places to fight injustice? Write your opinion in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. I hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment, sharing your thoughts about it. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new and equally exciting stories. See you in the next video.